In our time, we keep hearing the question, well, if we should believe in a God, which God should we believe in and why? Can you address this in your response?
In responding to these questions about the God of the Bible and which God is the true God, we will sometimes reference Him as Jehovah as a matter of distinction. Let us look at, first of all, the nature of Jehovah God as revealed to the early patriarchs. Number one, God is perfectly holy. God said to Moses, "Speak unto all the congregation of the children of Israel, and say unto them, Ye shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy." In contrast, the gods of the Mesopotamian and Mediterranean regions were vengeful, lustful, and often at war between themselves, especially as noted in their early creation accounts. The concept of a holy God could not have come from the surrounding culture. Pagan festivals were filled with all types of excess and immorality, whereas God required holy worship. Where did the concept of a holy God come from, unless it came from God Himself? Number two, God is also universally loving. No other deity was recognized as having universal love for all mankind. Most deities were favorable only or primarily to the nations who worshiped them. In a number of promises to Abraham, God repeatedly said through his seed all nations of the earth would be blessed. Number three, God is merciful and gracious. As it says in the Scriptures, "And the Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord God, merciful and gracious, long-suffering, and abundant in goodness and truth." The God of the Bible is portrayed as one who delights in showing mercy and favor to those who do not merit it. In other religions, there is a fear of falling out of favor with their God, leading even to the extent of child sacrifice to appease the gods. We point out that these concepts of God did not come from the ancient cultures, but were divine revelations that were recorded based on real experiences with God.
You explained that the Bible has a unified message. This seems pretty amazing considering the fact that it was written by different human authors. Can you give us a concise data statement on this?
Yes, the Bible proclaims this unified message in 66 books, though it was written by around 40 authors who lived in different geographical regions spanning over 1,500 years of time and whose lives encountered vastly different circumstances.
That's some noteworthy data about the formation of the Bible and its uniqueness. Can you tell us more about its content that you would consider evidence for its inspiration?
Yes, let's consider that. The Bible contains numerous fulfilled prophecies that validate its divine inspiration. The prophecies of 4 world empires. Daniel had visions in chapters 2 and 7 and 8 that were descriptive of 2 contemporary empires. They were Babylon and Medo-Persia, and they were also predictive of 2 future world empires, Greece and Rome. Daniel links the 4th world empire to the time of the appearance of the Messiah. Daniel's prophecies are so incredible that skeptics feel compelled to reject them as prophecy and declare them as backwritten history by multiple authors. However, we will give 4 compelling reasons that show these utterances to be prophetic and not merely backwritten history. Number 1, detailed eyewitness accounts are given regarding the contemporary empires of Babylon and Medo-Persia that Daniel describes in his language. And he also uses prophetic language about the future empires, which have less detail and are more predictive. In chapter 9, we find Daniel in Babylon praying for the return of the Jews to their homeland and predicting the rebuilding of Jerusalem, and then predicting the appearance of Messiah and the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in the 4th world empire. The present narrative and the predictive narrative are so intertwined that it's unreasonable to make the claim of multiple authors writing together in the same chapter. Number two, Jesus also speaks of Daniel's prophecy concerning the future destruction of Jerusalem by Rome. In Jesus' narrative, instruction is given to the reader. In Matthew 24:15 it says, "Whoso readeth," meaning the gospel account of this event would also be written before the event occurred. The readers were to notice certain signs and then to flee to the mountains. Jesus is standing between Daniel's predictions and the future fulfillment, and they reaffirm Daniel's prediction, showing it could not have been backwritten. Number three, most scholars accept that the first Old Testament translation into the Greek language began when Ptolemy authorized the translation of the Torah in 285 to 246 BC. The scholars continued on and translated the entire Old Testament. This would certainly rule out any possibility that Daniel was not completely written long before the fulfillment of the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Number four, the Jewish historian Josephus indicates that the whole Old Testament was completed by the time of the Persian ruler Artaxerxes in 464 to 424 BC, and that the book of Daniel was shown to Alexander the Great when he came to Jerusalem. This would convincingly place the completion of Daniel before the rise of the Roman Empire.
That is amazing how Daniel's prophecy stretches across such a large span of time. Not only did God inspire Daniel, but God arranged for it to be fulfilled in such a way as to make the evidence irrefutable. How about the return of the Jews to their homeland? That event was prophesied numerous times, and it also occurred in the time of Cyrus. Can you address this notable event?
We definitely want to talk about Cyrus's release of the Jews to return to their homeland. Many of the Old Testament prophets spoke of the Jews going into captivity and then returning again to their lands. Isaiah 44 verses 26-28 also prophesied approximately 150 years before it occurred and mentioned the king who would initiate this return and rebuilding as Cyrus by name. Skeptics have tried to introduce a second Isaiah as an author who wrote after the fact. However, this approach only creates more issues for the skeptics because Jeremiah 25:11-12 speaks of the same event and references 70 years of captivity followed by their return to their homeland. If the book of Isaiah needs multiple authors, then the book of Jeremiah would also. Isaiah is giving the name of a king for an event that a number of other prophets are predicting. How did any of the prophets know that the Jews would return to their land? The more authors the skeptics demand for the books of the Old Testament, the more they weaken the credibility of their case and show their prejudice against the prophetic evidence.
That's an interesting thought because we can tend to get frustrated when skeptics question good evidence. You are saying that when they challenge these prophecies with so many alternatives, it casts more doubt on their skepticism than it does on the prophecies.
Yes, that is true.
So how does this play out in the evidence for Jesus? A lot of skeptics say they don't even need to consider the evidence for the resurrection because they think Jesus is just a legendary figure and not a historical man. How do we respond to their demands for secular evidence that Jesus was a man of history?
Well, let me say, if I was a skeptic, I would certainly start here also because if for no other reason, it's the easiest position to take. Let's remember, nobody has all the answers to every possible objection. Some people will always say we don't have enough evidence. And it is important to remember that just because we do not and cannot know everything does not mean that we cannot know some things with certainty. We base our faith on the facts that we do know or can know from God's enduring Word rather than on what we do not or cannot know. The centuries of assaults on the Scriptures have demonstrated that God's Word endures in spite of skeptics' challenges. Now, let's look at some of the external witnesses for Jesus. Bible scholars estimate that there are more than 300 Old Testament predictions that refer to the Messiah, Jesus. These include events such as His advent, his nativity, his passion, and his resurrection. For example, Daniel 9 provides a very prescriptive timeline for the appearance of Messiah before the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Do we have external evidence that also validates the Messianic Bible prophecies? Well, let's separate the external evidence concerning Jesus into two parts. First, was he a legitimate historical figure? And then secondly, is there good evidence that he did rise from the dead? Let's look at Thallus first, from 52 AD. Thallus is perhaps the earliest secular writer to mention Jesus, although his writings have been lost. But Julius Africanus, a Christian writer, writing around 221 AD, does quote Thallus, who previously tried to explain the darkness occurring at Jesus' crucifixion. Quoting Thallus, "On the whole world there pressed a most fearful darkness, and the rocks were rent by an earthquake, and many places in Judea and other districts were thrown down. This darkness Thallus, in the third book of his history, calls, as appears to me without reason, an eclipse of the sun." The crucifixion occurred on the Passover, which is Nisan 14th, which is the middle of the month or full moon. A solar eclipse can only occur when the moon is close enough to the ecliptic plane during a new moon or beginning of the lunar month. Thallus is noting the unreasonable irregularity of this solar eclipse at the crucifixion, which occurred in the middle of a lunar month. Number two, we will introduce Tacitus from 56 to 120 AD. Cornelius Tacitus was a respected Roman historian. He was a senator under Emperor Vespasian and was also proconsul of Asia. In his Annals, written around 116 AD, he describes Emperor Nero's response to the great fire in Rome and Nero's claim that the Christians were to blame. He says, "Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, for whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of the procurators, Pontius Pilate. And a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out, not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular." Unquote. The crucifixion of Christ under Pontius Pilate is confirmed by Tacitus, meaning he believed that Jesus was recognized as an historical figure. Celsus was quite antagonistic to the claims of the gospel, but in his criticism, he unknowingly affirmed and reinforced the biblical authors and their content. His writing is extensive, and he alludes to 80 different biblical quotes, confirming their early appearance in history. In addition, he admits the miracles of Jesus were generally acknowledged in the early 2nd century. Quoting him now, "Jesus had come from a village in Judea and was the son of a poor Jewess who gained her living by the work of her own hands. His mother had been turned out of doors by her husband, who was a carpenter by trade, and on being convicted of adultery with a soldier named Panthera. Being thus driven away by her husband and wandering about in disgrace, she gave birth to Jesus, a bastard. Jesus, on account of his poverty, was hired out to go to Egypt. While there, he acquired certain magical powers, which Egyptians pride themselves on possessing. He returned home, highly elated at possessing these powers, and on the strength of them, gave himself out to be a god." Unquote. Celsus obviously recognizes there was such a man named Jesus. He recognizes the belief in the virgin birth and is trying to provide an earthly father for Jesus other than Joseph. He recognizes that Jesus went to Egypt and then returned and performed miracles. He's trying to provide a magical explanation for those miraculous powers. Fifthly, we have Josephus, living between 37 and 101 AD. Josephus writes in more detail than any other ancient secular historian about Jesus in his Antiquities of the Jews in 93 AD. Josephus was born just a few years, perhaps as little as 3, after the crucifixion. His history includes 3 passages about Christians and 1 that describes the death of John the Baptist, 1 that mentions the execution of James, and a final disputed passage called the Testimonium Flavianum, which describes Jesus as a wise man and the Christ. There's a lot of controversy about the Testimonium Flavianum because the earliest discovered copies of his writings are said to be late enough to have been rewritten by Christians who are accused by skeptics of making interpolations into the text. So, to be fair, we'll examine a proposed scholarly reconstruction of the Testimonium Flavianum passage that is stripped of the alleged Christian embellishment. Quote, "Now around this time lived Jesus, a wise man, for he was a worker of amazing deeds and was a teacher of people who gladly accept the truth. He won over both many Jews and many Greeks. Pilate, when he heard him accused by the leading men among us, condemned him to the cross. But those who had first loved him did not cease doing so. To this day, the tribe of Christians named after him has not disappeared." Unquote. Even with the reconstruction of this passage, the testimony is sufficient for Josephus to be a clear witness to the historicity of Christ and his crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. Additionally, there are other references to John the Baptist and James, the brother of Jesus, thus validating both Jesus and surrounding events. However, we are not going to give the skeptics a pass without questioning the basis of their skepticism. Questions we have for the skeptics. Why is it that of the 120 Greek and 170 extant Latin manuscripts of Josephus, the only copies which survived have the Testimonium Flavianum in them? How did an interpolator make sure all the other copies were destroyed and only the ones with the interpolations would survive? Furthermore, 3 early church writers at 5 different times reference other sections of Josephus's writings that indicate that Jesus was the brother of James. How does rejecting the Testimonium Flavianum completely eliminate Josephus's testimony regarding the historicity of Jesus Christ? Number 6, the most famous Jewish Talmudic passage about Jesus says this: "It was taught, on the day before the Passover they hanged Jesus. A herald went before him for 40 days proclaiming, 'He will be stoned because he practiced magic and enticed Israel to go astray. Let anyone who knows anything in his favor come forward and plead for him.' But nothing was found in his favor, and they hanged him on the day before the Passover." The confirmations here are that Jesus was a man of history. He was crucified before Passover. The Jews had a part in the condemnation, and no one defended Jesus at his trial. Number 7, Julian the Apostate, the Roman emperor between 361 and 363, has a writing called Against the Galileans. Both of Emperor Julian's parents were Christians, but he rejected Christianity and tried to take Rome back to its traditional roots of paganism. His writings are an attempt to refute the Christian claims. In seeking to disprove the deity of Christ, he provided proof that he was a man of history. Here's an excerpt. "Even Jesus, who was proclaimed among you, was one of Caesar's subjects. And if you do not believe me, I will prove it a little later, or rather let me simply assert it now. However, you admit that with his father and mother he registered his name in the governorship of Cyrenius." Julian argues for Jesus being merely a man based on the fact that he can prove his name was registered in the Roman records when Cyrenius was the governor. This validates his birth as a man and that his name was recorded in the Roman census.
That's quite conclusive evidence for the historical Jesus. But how do you move from that to providing evidence of the resurrection?
Okay, Joe. Let's summarize some arguments for the resurrection of Christ. The resurrection of Jesus Christ is presented as infallible proof of our faith in Acts chapter 1 verse 3 and then again in 1 Corinthians 15. There are 4 gospel accounts which are written by different authors to different audiences that testify of the resurrection. Those 4 authors corroborate the resurrection account, but yet it's obvious the authors were not in collusion to align all the details. They simply report what they saw or heard by eyewitnesses. It was prophesied in Old Testament scriptures, Isaiah 26 verse 19, Psalm 16 verse 10, chapter 68 verse 18, and Hosea chapter 6 verse 2. Also, Jesus prophesied in the Gospels in advance of his death that he would rise again. His enemies knew about his prediction to rise again. But after the resurrection and ascension, the eyewitnesses of it began to preach about it to the same people who crucified him. Their testimony began at Jerusalem. They had the opportunity to show it to be a hoax if that is what it was. Continuing Jesus' teachings as an innocent martyr could have created empathy, but claiming that he rose from the dead was placing all their credibility on the line. The Jews and the Romans were antagonistic to this new sect. They only needed to show evidence of a body to dispel the whole resurrection as a myth. By stating that they guarded the body, they actually admitted that they had it. They said perhaps the guards were sleeping, but they could not say for sure that it was stolen. If it was stolen, why is there no historical evidence of an attempt to recover it? The apostles gave their lives for their belief in the resurrection. Men will give their lives when they are deceived about the truth, but they will not give their lives for what they know to be a myth which they fabricated. Rome was moved from persecuting Christians to accepting the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ as a fact. How did the pagan antagonists become convinced without the facts? Julian tried to refute the fact of the resurrection, but could not convince the populace to disbelieve it and go back into paganism. Does this not indicate that the fact of the resurrection was not easily dismissed? All that the enemies of Christianity needed to do to crush the Christian movement was produce evidence that Jesus never arose. Where is there another parallel in human history of a lowly, uneducated man born into poverty, without the support of the state or the religious establishment, who in 3.5 years of ministry equipped 12 other largely poor and uneducated men to evangelize the world and change the course of human history? How did the testimony of these early evangelists convince other educated men to become ardent and effective apologists for the Christian faith? Even with the facts, how did early evangelists overcome the extreme prejudice against the resurrection story? Except for the fact that they were also endued with the power of the same Spirit that raised up Christ from the dead. The ongoing power of the resurrection is also the evidence of the resurrection.
Amen. We need both the evidence and the power as witnesses for the resurrection. How would you counter someone who stubbornly insisted that in spite of all this evidence, some of these prophecies could have been human predictions of world trends and likely events?
Well, Joe, when prophecies spanning so much time, it's impossible to make predictions on world power trends because there is no trend data and therefore no way to predict these trends or these details. For example, how do you predict the rise of the Roman Empire before they even exist as a nation of significant power? Further, it is mathematically improbable to assume that these fulfilled prophecies were humanly predictable. Some mathematicians have calculated it this way. One person fulfilling 8 specific prophecies is 1 chance in 100 quadrillion. One person fulfilling 48 prophecies is 1 chance in 10 to the 157th power. One person fulfilling 300 plus prophecies? Well, we're not going to do the math, but we'll give you our answer. Irrefutable proof of inspiration. There are no other sacred books in the world that even come close to the scope of fulfilled prophecies contained in the Bible.
Thank you for sharing those very persuasive figures. Now, can we talk about science in the Bible?